Jesus said, "Man cannot live on bread alone, but from every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." You're listening to Daily Truth.
In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen His glory. And so we know that Jesus is the eternal Son of God, that just like the Father, He existed as a most pure spirit without body, parts, and passions all the way up until approximately 2,000 years ago, at which point, by the power of the Spirit and through the Virgin Mary, in addition to being the divine second member of the Trinity, a most pure spirit without body, parts, and passions, He also took upon Himself a second nature, the human nature. This did not replace the divine nature, but merely concealed the divine nature. And this is why we see in Philippians chapter 2, where it says that Jesus did not count equality with God as something to be grasped, but rather emptied Himself. He humbled Himself, taking on the likeness of man. That text is easily misconstrued, misinterpreted. When the text says in Philippians 2 that Jesus did not count equality with God, that is God the Father, as something to be grasped, the better rendering is something to be clinged to. So what is being said is not that equality with God the Father was out of Jesus' reach because He existed eternally, but as an inferior being to the Father. No. Rather, equality with God was not something out of His reach that He could not grasp, but rather it was something He always eternally possessed, that He was equal to the Father. And therefore, because He knew that He is equal in majesty, divinity, and worthiness of worship, He did not cling to that equality, but He was willing to let it go, as it were. Not in the literal sense, but let it go by being concealed in the human nature. So Jesus has always had eternal equality with the Father. And that's one of the things that you can detect when someone is actually an equal, when someone is actually truly worthy of honor and dignity and respect, is that they don't behave in ways that are insecure. And Jesus was willing to take on the human nature, concealing the divine nature, and in that way, not in a literal sense, but optically appearing as though He emptied Himself. He did not actually in the incarnation empty Himself of the divine nature. Rather, it merely appeared as though the divine nature had been removed because it had been concealed. So as Augustine once said, that Jesus is divinity wrapped in flesh. This is, on God's part, in a sense, we might say divine trickery. That Jesus, the divine, now wrapped in flesh, the divinity served as the hook, and the flesh served as the bait. And the serpent went hook, line, and sinker, taking the bait, not seeing the hook, not realizing that all of his prodding and tempting towards the crucifixion was actually sealing his own demise. That Satan actually destroyed himself, thinking this is the one moment in history where Jesus, the Son of God, is now vulnerable, but not realizing that the divinity of Christ was still there, fully intact, and that by seemingly conquering Christ, He actually did precisely that which would seal His ultimate doom. And so Jesus has always existed. He is eternally begotten, not made, but eternally begotten. He has always existed as God the Father and as God the Holy Spirit, that is, as a most pure spirit without body, parts, and passions. That said, in real time, in real human history, there is a moment in the incarnation where He not replaces the divine nature with the human nature, but adds to His divinity a second nature, namely the human nature. And in that way, there is simply not the literal sense, but the perception of an emptying of the divine nature, not because it's actually going away or being removed, but because it's being concealed by the flesh, by the human nature. He is divinity wrapped in flesh. So there's a little bit of theology proper, Trinitarian doctrine, Christology for us.
All right, hold up. You're not going to want to miss this. I'm going to tell you exactly how our spring 2024 conference is going to go down. Here's the title of the conference: Blueprints for Christendom 2.0. Subtitle: 7 Doctrines for Ruling the World. We're going to have 7 primary sessions covering each of these doctrines for ruling the world righteously. Number 1, Reformed Confessionalism. That's going to be Pastor Doug Wilson preaching on that topic. Then we've got Covenant Theology with Pastor Brian Sauvé. Then we've got Biblical Patriarchy with Pastor Michael Foster. Then we've got Presuppositionalism with Dr. Joseph Boot. Then we've got Kuyperianism, All of Christ for All of Life, where we're going to welcome Pastor Doug Wilson back for a second session. Then we've got General Equity Theonomy. We're going to have Dr. Joseph Boot come and do a second session on that topic. And then lastly, we'll have Pastor Dale Partridge on postmillennial eschatology. In addition to these 7 sessions, we're also going to have not 1, but 2 live podcasts. On the first day of the conference, that's Friday, March 1st, we're going to have a live Theology Applied podcast. I'll be on the stage hosting the discussion with Douglas Wilson, Michael Foster, and Eric Kahn from It's Good to Be a Man. The topic is going to be all about biblical patriarchy. We're going to specifically be parsing out, distinguishing the biblical doctrinal differences between patriarchy and complementarianism. Again, that's Friday, March 1st, the first day of the conference, a live Theology Applied podcast on biblical patriarchy. Then we're going to have the next day, that's Saturday, March 2nd, a live Haunted Cosmos podcast. I'll be hosting this discussion with Brian Sauvé and Ben Garrett. We're going to be talking about the Nephilim. We're going to be talking about the Watchers. We're going to be talking about what creatures currently are living underneath the surface of the earth and chasms of the deep. It's going to be wacky. It's going to be weird, but it will also be thoroughly biblical and incredibly unhinged. So you're not going to want to miss these 2 live podcasts: Theology Applied on Friday, March 1st, the first day of the conference, on biblical patriarchy with Doug Wilson, Michael Foster, Eric Kahn, and myself. And then the next day of the conference, Saturday, March 2nd, a live Haunted Cosmos podcast with Brian Sauvé and Ben Garrett and myself on the Nephilim, the Watchers, and what lies under the surface of the earth. And then the conference will hold over for one final, the third and final day. That's going to be the Lord's Day, Sunday, March 3rd, where one of our speakers will be holding over to preach the Lord's Day sermon, and I'll be leading us in worship through the liturgy. So we've got 3 days, a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, March 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 2024, Blueprints for Christendom 2.0, 7 Doctrines for Ruling the World. You're not going to want to miss this conference. Our early bird rate is still available, but only for a very short period of time. We are ending the early bird rate on August 31st at 11:59 p.m. That will be the final chance to get into this conference at an affordable, cheap rate. All right, so go and take advantage of the early bird rate right now by going to rightresponseconference.com. Again, that's rightresponseconference.com to register for Blueprints for Christendom 2.0, March 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 2024. Register today.